Welcome to question period in the Alberta Legislature. My name is David Carter, Speaker of the House and MLA for Calgary-Egmont. After question period today, the House will be dealing with the budget estimates of the Department of Education. On Friday of this week, the House will be wrapping up the round of discussions with regard to the provincial budget. According to standing orders, a set number of days are set aside for this process, and that will come to completion on Friday. Then in the next weeks, the House will be discussing the estimates of the Heritage Savings and Trust Fund. And as things are going with the House, we're likely to be sitting until the third week of June.
And our people, we pledge ourselves to act as good stewards on behalf of all Albertans. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions.
Member for Edmonton Gold-Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to present a petition on behalf of a number of investors in First Investors of Canada and Associated Investors of Canada who request that this legislature institute a committee to investigate the possibility of a plan to acquire the assets of FIC and AIC from the receiver manager Coopers and Lybrand.
Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to table the 82nd Annual Report of the Department of Education for the period April 1, 1986 to March 31, 1987. Copies will be distributed to all members.
Introduction of special guests.
Member for Edmonton Gold-Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you and through you to the members of this Assembly 10 members of the Principal Investors Protection Association from Edmonton. They are led by their president, Mrs. Cheryl Brown. They're seated in the public gallery, Mr. Speaker, and I would ask that they rise and receive the warm welcome of the members of the Assembly.
Member for Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche, followed by Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud today to introduce to all members of this Assembly 97 grade 6 students from the Athabasca Elementary School located in the beautiful historical town of Athabasca. The town of Athabasca Landing was considered as a potential site for the capital of Alberta during the debates of 1906. It is located geographically in the center of Alberta. Accompanying these very bright and enthusiastic students are teachers Louis Schickinger, Dorothy Ryan, Larry Armfelt, David McGuire, Ron Galunka, Mrs. Berry, and bus drivers Mr. Rounseville and Mr. Petrokovich. I would ask them to please stand and receive the warm welcome and applause from all members of this Assembly.
Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, seated in the members' gallery are 26 young students from the Parkview Elementary School. They are accompanied by their teacher, Miss D. Meyer, as well as parents, Mrs. Closton, Mrs. McKinley, Mrs. Perry, and Mrs. Kemper. I welcome the students, the parents, and teachers to our Assembly today, and I ask all members to give them the traditional welcome.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
The Chair would just like to point out for the information of all members in the House that today has been agreed that there would be one photographer in to take stock photos of all members so that the Chair is not inundated by a bunch of messages saying what's the procedure today. We just want to draw that to the attention of all members. Leader of the Opposition, please.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to direct my question to the Premier, and it has to do with ethics in government, something this government seems to have trouble with. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, our friend the Minister of Environment gave a little speech to the Conservatives in Athabasca. And in the speech, among other things, I take it, Mr. Speaker, he suggested that residents of the local area could not expect such things as government funding and projects unless they elected a member of the Premier's party. I'm told, Mr. Speaker, that he's made similar speeches around the province, mainly in opposition ridings. My question to the Premier, has the Premier disciplined the Minister of Environment and told him very clearly that these types of public statements are sleazy and unacceptable?
It's remarkable, Mr. Speaker, that when you get information secondhand, how often it gets so badly distorted. The honourable member, as any member of our government would say, is that certainly we welcome the opportunity to help all areas of this province, but that there are certain times when you are able to communicate more directly with the government under an active MLA in the government. That just is a fact of life. Nevertheless, I make a commitment to all the members in this legislature that the government's desire is to assist Albertans in every part of this province.
That's very nice. That's very nice, Mr. Speaker, but you have ministers making these statements, and by the Premier's answer, I take he's condoning the Minister of Environment's statement. And I would ask him clearly if this is a deliberate policy that's trying to blackmail members, saying you have to have a government member before you're going to get anything.
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the Honourable Leader of the Opposition has got his second question, written out, ready to ask before listening to my answer. Right. The policy that I stated in my answer to his first question is exactly opposite to what he stated in framing his second question. Now, they can't come in here with the questions all laid out in advance and just repeat them by memory or by reading them and not pay any attention to the answer. Might I say, too, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member, not having been present at the occasion when the Minister of Environment was speaking, has a lot of nerve now coming and saying things that he said are sleazy and so on when he wasn't even there and doesn't know what he said.
Reports, my dear.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier got up in his first question and said yes, that people do have more access through government members. That's what he said. And if he'd listened to the questions, he'd understand that. And my question is to the Premier, if he's saying now that that's not the case, then why hasn't he taken the Minister of Environment and said stop these sorts of public statements? And there were people there, and if the Premier's unaware of that, then he's just not doing his job.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, obviously the one person who wasn't there was the person who is now referring to another member in this House as sleazy. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, whether you would direct me as to whether that is something that we should, as a House, accept as a way of discussing another member in the House. It's always been my opinion that while we are on opposite parts of the philosophical spectrum, that we hardly bring credit to the House when we handle ourselves in the manner, or credit to our parties, when we handle ourselves in the manner that the Leader of the Opposition is doing today.
Oh, come on, now who was it, Mr. Minister of Environment on?
Speaker, I would like to give notice, Mr. Speaker, that I'll be raising a point of order at the conclusion of the question period.
Thank you.
You sleazy called your practice sleazy.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier may want to hide in what I said, but the reality is that this minister and perhaps other ministers have been making statements around the province, and the Premier made it himself during the election and the member from Little Bull's riding. Right. My question is, does the Premier not fail to appreciate that these comments reflect a misuse of state power for a narrow partisan interest?
Right. That's all.
Again, Mr. Speaker, he's obviously ignoring the answer to his first question, which I said the government, and I made the commitment to all members in the House that the government is trying to help Albertans throughout this province. And anybody who wants to distort that, I guess, can, and the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is trying to. And if I understand now, Mr. Speaker, that they're going to fall back on saying, yes, we can get away with somehow intimating you're sleazy, but we didn't actually say it, that's the cheapest kind of political attempt.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. While pleased to hear the Premier recognize that it is a rather sleazy practice to go around the province to say that, and I'm pleased to hear the Premier say that. Could he give some assurance to the public of Alberta that he has instructed his ministers and his backbenchers not to go around and say things like that, because it does bring discredit to all politicians, not just the government side?
Well, there again, Mr. Speaker, we now have another person who wasn't there. First, he gets up and distorts what I said. I never said, and that is absolutely false, but we're used to the honourable member trying to twist things like that, and it's nice to be able to get up and straighten him out, because he's tried again. There is no way I said that the member, the Minister of Environment, was in any way conducting himself in a sleazy manner. That implication allegation came from the Leader of the Opposition. And for you to automatically fall in under it, I think doesn't bring credit to you or your party either. And you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
The chair rises to bring to the attention of all members the motion 359-10. Question ought not to refer to statements made outside the House by a minister. And we also have the other matter of imputing motives or casting aspersions upon the persons within the House or out of it, which is 359 subsection 7. But in addition, the whole range of questions needs to be examined in terms of 359-10. Let's not start arguing about what's going on outside of the House. We have enough trouble dealing with what's inside the House most of the times. All right, Chair recognizes supplementary Clover Bar.
Mr. Speaker, a question to the Honourable Premier. It's a common practice in provinces other than Alberta where either you're in or you're out. If you're Liberal and the party's in power, the road stops here. If Conservatives are in power and you're Conservative, the road starts there and goes on down the road. Is there any direction, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, to the members of the Executive Council, that all constituencies must be treated equally?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question to the member from Edmonton Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, my questions are to the Treasurer. On Monday of this week, the official opposition produced figures from the government's own publications showing that the effective rate of taxation on individual Albertans has consistently gone up over the last 17 years, while the effective rate of corporate taxation has consistently gone down. The Treasurer responded to that, and I quote, "When corporations start to lose money as a result of the decrease in oil and gas revenues, obviously their tax proportion reduces. So yesterday we produced figures, government figures, showing that, for example, corporations made a pre-tax profit of some $7 billion in 1986 and actually got more money back from the corporate tax system than they paid into it. Does the Treasurer think it fair in any way that corporations in Alberta could make a profit of almost $7 billion and pay no taxes on those profits and in fact wind up with extra money out of the tax system?"
Well, I guess the last lecture in economics fell on deaf ears. The member from Norwood could understand it, so they turned to the other expert. Let me begin again, Mr. Speaker, by saying that, as I pointed out clearly in the last 2 days that this has been raised, that the NDP analysis is fraught with futility and is faulty in its analysis. It is absolutely a misrepresentation of the statistics, and anyone can draw conclusions if they manipulate the data to the extent that the socialists have just done over the past 2 days. But I will lay out again, Mr. Speaker, very clearly for the member from Kingsway, just what it is that this government is achieving in its fiscal plan and how equity and fairness prevails and is pervasive in everything that we do with respect to our tax policy. First of all, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the analysis of corporate tax revenues and corporate tax paid, you must do two things which the NDP have failed to do. First of all, you must understand that corporate income and taxable income are very different concepts, far different concepts. Secondly, Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. Order. Provincial Treasurer.
It's difficult, Premier.
Thank you. Provincial Treasurer.
Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've pointed out, those two different concepts certainly would, if you were to analyze it, show the following, that in fact the socialists have elected to deal with income as opposed to taxable income, and everyone well knows that in calculating taxable income, losses are deducted for arriving at taxable income in terms of what you pay tax upon. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, here's the interesting fault in the NDP analysis, that what they did, they were selective in deciding what it was they would use in calculating this income amount, but what they forgot to do, Mr. Speaker, was to add back or to properly handle the royalty tax credit, which in Alberta is handled through the tax system, through the corporate tax system. Royalty taxes are not in any way used to determine what the tax income is or the taxable income is, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, here is the fact. If you were to properly use the data that the NDP provided, you would find, Mr. Speaker, that the corporate income tax on average is higher than the provincial individual tax in this province by about 0.5% over the same period the NDP are looking at. Their analysis is false.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Hard facts, Mr. Treasurer, is what we used. Can the Treasurer inform the Assembly whether or not this ongoing decline in the effective rate of income tax paid by corporations in Alberta is a matter of conscious government policy, or is it just some remarkable accident, one that the government intends to correct shortly?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I've already indicated that if you properly use the numbers and deal with what it is corporations have paid in this province, remembering that there's a very volatile backdrop to the economy, oil and gas sector is volatile, as even the member from Kingsway should know, that in fact you'll find that the corporations, using the same analysis the socialists provided, have paid more tax. Now, if you want to read my lips, they paid more tax, not less tax.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Treasurer said, maybe we could use cue cards here so I could describe to the member, meaning the official opposition leader, how the tax system operates. Well, Mr. Speaker, for the Treasurer's information, the effective corporate tax rate goes down.
Nice try, member for Edmonton Kingsway, but it really is a violation of Beauchene 333 to be doing what the member was just doing. Perhaps, order please, honourable member. Perhaps we could get to the question now.
Yes. Can the Treasurer identify what it is about individual incomes that requires that they be taxed at an ever-increasing effective rate while the corporate tax profits are taxed at an ever-declining rate? What is it that demands that from this government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, the member hasn't listened either to this budget or the last budget because, of course, what we have done in dealing with the individual tax in this province is the following, that we have over this current year reduced significantly the personal income tax in this province so that the flat tax, which applied against taxable income, is reduced by 0.5%, 50% of that tax. What that does, Mr. Speaker, is free up more people on the selective tax reduction. About 500,000 Albertans are now taken off the tax lists as a result of those changes. And as I have said repeatedly, and I will say again, this province has the best tax regime of any province in Canada, building on the strengths of the lowest personal income tax, not increasing the corporate tax, and of course, Mr. Speaker, not having a sales tax in this province. You know, Mr. Speaker, for a while there during the period, I kept having this recurring bad dream. I thought that the Leader of the Opposition had changed the Treasury critic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is it not the case that this government's policy over the long term is to do away with the corporate income tax entirely and place the entire income tax burden on individual Albertans?
Well, for once in his life, he may have come to an important observation, which is not so much in terms of the current tax regime that we're facing, Mr. Speaker, but in terms of the elements of the value-added tax. Now, if you talked in a very real situation, and if he is being serious about this as opposed to trying to take some political credit for something he doesn't understand, then you might notice that if the value-added tax is imposed, there is, in fact, a shift to consumption away from income. And that, of course, is a fair argument. And I said to the member from Vermilion Viking yesterday that we will be prepared to take on this debate in the national context. But to suggest that it's now taking place here in Alberta presently is false, is wrong, and is wrong-headed, Mr. Speaker. This government has not done that at all. It has freed up more Albertans to allow disposable income to be put back in their hands. Retail sales are up. Investment is up.
Thank you, Honourable Member for Kingsway. Honourable Member for Kingsway. Please do not raise that piece of paper again for the third time in the House. The Chair recognizes Westlock Sturgeon on a supplementary.
I see. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer, and while Albertans appreciate that he does not tax the corporate profits that are reinvested in the province, Mr. Speaker, is he working on any system to tax the corporate profits that are transferred out of the province?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm always flabbergasted when somebody who reputed to have been in the private sector, who understands how the corporate tax system should operate, is making statements of this order, Mr. Speaker. You should well know, Mr. Speaker, that before a corporation can distribute any dollars by way of dividends, it has to pay tax first. Because it's paid on the taxable income is then calculated. Whatever remains is then available for dividends. And what I've indicated before, Mr. Speaker, is that we have found in the case of Alberta oil and gas companies in particular, first of all, that in fact they have reinvested a very large percentage of their profits right back here in this province. Their cash flow goes back into oil and gas exploration, the development of the kinds of province that we think is important. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the small corporations, our analysis is now showing that in fact many small corporations have done just the same, investing back into new jobs, into plants, into new equipment, new processes, new research. And that's what we're trying to do, to encourage that kind of move by the private sector. Because ultimately, Mr. Speaker, unless you have that kind of a climate, which we have here in Alberta, which the proof is now showing, Mr. Speaker, then you will not have investment, and then you will not have job creation. We think job creation is a big priority for us. That's why we're providing a comfortable place for the private sector to operate for new investment.
Thank you. Member for Westlock Sturgeon has asked the supplementary. Will then not engage in this kind of discussion, please. Chair now recognizes Westlock Sturgeon on behalf of the Liberal caucus.
Mr. Speaker, you excited me so much I forgot my main question there.
Are you prepared to pass?
No, I was just seeing how quick you could spring up there. Goes, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Community and Occupational Health, Mr. Speaker, because of the fear of AIDS, many of the political jurisdictions around the world are working and experimenting with different forms of blood tests, whether mandatory or not. Yet, to my surprise, Mr. Speaker, here that this government has introduced a bill that will put an end to blood testing and before marriage licenses are granted, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to know from the Minister why, at this particular time, when the public is so worried about blood tests, has the Minister dropped or is the government contemplating dropping the mandatory blood testing before marriage license?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the test that was performed under the Marriage Act that is being amended by a bill introduced by the member for Cardston yesterday refers to the elimination of a test for syphilis that is no longer in this day and age required. That given that in 16 years, one case of congenital syphilis has been found as a result of this requirement, we felt that it was no longer necessary to require that test prior to individuals getting a marriage license.
Mr. Speaker, one might argue that that proves that it's working. Mr. Speaker, who wants to report with a negative test? Mr. Speaker, but that does not answer the question that the blood haven't been taken. And admittedly, maybe syphilis is not a concern of the minister anymore. But could the minister not explain why not run an AIDS test on it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the case of two individuals, a man and a woman, just making a decision to get married, we felt that that was a very low-risk group in terms of acquiring the AIDS virus. And as a result, we don't feel that that's an effective way of controlling or eliminating the disease.
Well, Mr. Speaker, for the information of the minister, heterosexuals are coming down with it a lot now, and they're usually the ones that are getting married, Mr. Speaker. Is the government doing any further thinking into the process of possibly making AIDS testing a possibility to anyone in the normal course of blood tests, say medicals or anything like that? Would the government pay for AIDS testing if the blood test does that?
Mr. Speaker, the government does that now.
Mr. Speaker, the government, I gather, tests on a voluntary basis if the blood is, or if the request from the patient. Would he go a step further, though, and tell us what the plans are for, or if there are any plans for mandatory testing of AIDS, say in criminal institutions or in civil service, where blood tests are taken as a regular process?
Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't believe that mandatory testing, either for those couples before they get married or any other kind of mandatory testing, is the way to eliminate this deadly disease. The way to do it is through the program that we introduced last October, and which we'll continue to promote, is through an education and awareness process. We're not going to take a medical approach. We're going to take a health approach to this disease, and by informing our young Albertans, informing physicians, informing those in the working community how they prevent the acquisition of this disease, that's the approach to take. Mandatory testing is not.
Thank you. Edmonton Centre, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to regulations around AIDS, is the minister going to bring in an amendment or some regulation, change of regulations, which will make it permissible for embalmers to embalm those who have died of AIDS or other infectious diseases in this province?
Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, and I have been discussing this matter with the Alberta Funeral Services Association, and I believe you'll be seeing some changes in that regard in the days ahead.
Okay, Clover Bar.
Very supplementary question to the Honourable Solicitor General. Is the Minister in a position to indicate what educational programs are available or going on in our correctional institutes to enlighten the people in those institutions as to the dangers of AIDS?
Mr. Speaker, the administration of the correctional institutions and the guards and their associations within those institutions are currently reviewing that situation and coming up with an in-house program to ensure that everybody is aware of the dangers of AIDS, having a better mechanism to detect it, and to implement some way of protecting not only the inmates but essentially the workers from contamination.
Member for Little Bow.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier, and it's with regards to the Western Premiers Conference in Parksville, British Columbia, May 18th to the 21st. The matter of interest rates in Canada being established by the federal government has a thrust whereby the federal government believes interest rates should rise to counteract possible inflation that may be created in central Canada. Would the Premier indicate whether that specific item would be an item for the agenda, and would the province of Alberta be taking a very strong stand against any unusual increases in interest rates?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the honourable member raising that issue, because it is one of the points that the Alberta government will be stressing at the Western Premiers Conference. It is also a point we will be stressing at the Premiers Conference, all premiers, in Saskatchewan this summer. And I want to assure the honourable member that this government believes that the policy of having higher interest rates to support the Canadian dollar, we think, is wrong. And if you also tie it to a position of fighting inflation that appears in the minds of some to be generated out of central Canada, we say take a look at all of Canada, and you will see that much of Canada is now just coming out of some tough times. And in fact, to help us in this growth and rebound of the economy that we're experiencing here in Alberta and other parts of Canada, we want to have lower interest rates. We want to have a lower dollar so we can export and compete throughout the world, and that those lower interest rates will help our small businesses and individuals in this province to make sure that this rebound in our economy continues.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, Senate reform. Will the Premier have a strategy put together to try and unite the 4 Western Premiers on the subject of Senate reform, so that the presentation to the 10 Premiers in the summer will be a concerted effort from the West?
Mr. Speaker, I have been working on that issue with Western Premiers in the past. Again, I'm pleased the honourable member raises it. We have, as he knows, been able to persuade the Premier of British Columbia to take a public position of supporting the EEE Senate. We have all the Western Premiers, even before the Manitoba election. We had the Western Premiers all in support of Senate reform. And I'm sure that Premier Devine supports Senate reform, and I'm hoping that he will also see his way clear to support EEE Senate. I've not been able to discuss the matter personally with the Premier of Manitoba. I'm looking forward to that opportunity, but it will definitely be a point that we will raise at every opportunity when premiers get together, either in Saskatchewan this summer, the Western Premiers in British Columbia, and at First Ministers' meeting. You know, we are looking forward to a discussion on Senate reform at the First Ministers' meetings this year as well.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, the subject of the Western Diversification Department. In the last few days, I've had the opportunity of working with 1 or 2 applications being processed through the department. I've found that my question to the Premier, would the Premier discuss with his counterparts of the West the decision-making process with regards to the Western Diversification Department, whereas now decisions are still made in Ottawa rather than finalized right here in the head office of Edmonton? Would that be a subject on the agenda, and could the Premier do everything possible to correct that default in decision-making now?
Mr. Speaker, I'd certainly be prepared to raise the quickness of the decision-making, and also the fact that it should be made here as the original intent was when the program was announced. I only say I'll be prepared to because it will depend to some extent on the information provided to me by my Minister of Economic Development and Trade, who is working with the Western Diversification Office on a regular basis, and perhaps he may want to add to my answer now.
Speaker, we are, as the Premier indicated, in contact with the Western Diversification Office, and I in turn with the Minister responsible, Mr. McKnight, and that contact is on a regular basis. We also work with the applicants, Alberta applicants, in supporting them in representations when they ask us to the Western Diversification Office. There is some frustration, Mr. Speaker, by those who have applied and by ourselves to the pace of response by the Western Diversification Office to those applications, and that frustration, I think, is shared by a number of members of the Assembly.
Final supplementary, followed by Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my final supplementary is in terms of agenda and as well. Some of the Western manufacturers have the opportunity of getting some of the contracts for the manufacture of parts for the nuclear power submarines being contracted by the federal government. Would the Premier raise that matter so that a fair proportion of contracts associated with nuclear submarines could be awarded to Western-based companies?
Mr. Speaker, in the Western Premiers conferences that I've been involved in, the whole matter of contracting for federal purchases have been raised at every one, and we have in each one of those expressed our desire to see a greater balance in the awarding of contracts throughout the country. The honourable member raises the specific of the nuclear submarines. I will certainly accept his representation in that regard, discuss it with my colleagues, and see whether the Western Premiers Conference is the right place. It's strictly a matter of judgment to deal with that on a specific basis, or whether we should deal directly with the federal government. But I agree with his point and his representation. Certainly will follow up in the area that I feel will do us the most good.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in regards to the high interest rate policy, and I took it by the Premier's answer, there will be discussion about the rising dollar, and I agree with him that affects us dramatically in a negative sense in this province. But will there be any discussion, and I think we have to look at, about the effect of the Mulroney trade deal in terms of interlocking the economies also leading to a rising dollar? Will that be discussed?
Yeah.
It may be discussed peripherally, Mr. Speaker, but I know that the other premiers and myself do not accept the proposition made by the honourable members that this is such a linking of our two countries, that interest rates and dollar will go in lockstep. In fact, we believe this is a trading agreement. It is that. It's nothing more than that, but it is a trading commercial agreement that every nation in the world would like to have with the United States. They don't, and we do. And rather than looking on it in a negative way, as the honourable member does, we're looking at it in a very positive way as a tremendous opportunity for Alberta.
Member for Edmonton Strathcona, followed by Calgary Buffalo.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Transportation and Utilities and concerns fare trucking rates. The Whitemud Freeway Ring Road improvements in Edmonton are financed 75% by the province and 25% by the city, Mr. Speaker. Government rates for trucking are $36.85, as I'm sure the Minister knows, with a 7.5 cubic metre load. The city rate is $32.50. Truckers currently on that job are being paid $13 a load, which comes to less than $26 an hour. After expenses, this leaves the average trucker with only $2 or $3 an hour wages. My question, Mr. Speaker, is why does the government not impose a fair rate requirement to go along with the provincial funding?
Mr. Speaker, in meeting with the group last, I believe it was Thursday, we indicated to them at that time that that particular job, in this sense, was a contractor supply, where the contractor was working with the trucks, and it was an issue with the City of Edmonton, who decide where the projects are going to be and then tender them out on that basis. We provide the funds on a 75-25 basis, and they, elected as we are, make the decisions as to how they are in fact invested in those projects. The other thing I think that's very important, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that the contract that the city has with its various contractors indicates in there that they must, the wages or the salaries or the fees must be fair and reasonable. And we suggested to the group at that point that they then must approach the City of Edmonton to make their case.
But it's still public money. You can put conditions on it. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, the contractor regularly overfills the trucks 50%, giving an effective rate for the trucker and his or her $70,000 outfit of half the government rate. By what reasoning does the government consider that a fair way of treating working men and women?
Again, Mr. Speaker, the question relates to an issue between the City of Edmonton and the contractor and the contractor's subcontractor and the subcontractor and the truckers. I answered those particular questions in detail on Thursday in response to other questions that were raised, and indicated that once the truckers had explained to me that there was a concern over overloading and speeding, I then have forwarded a letter to the Mayor of the City of Edmonton expressing a concern about that and asking for him to deal with it.
Exactly. I'm glad the Minister then does acknowledge some responsibility to go along with the provincial funding. To the Premier, Mr. Speaker, what's the point of having a government or municipal rate if it can be shrugged off simply by contracting out? Will the Premier ask his Committee on Municipal Affairs, which was recently formed, to ensure appropriate stipulations of at least all provincially funded contracts?
Mr. Speaker, it's the Provincial Municipal Council that the honourable member is referring to, and which is to deal with broad principles between the government, the provincial government and municipal governments throughout this province to make sure that we are working in a coordinated way. The honourable member has a different point of view than the government has about imposing conditions and imposing one level of government on top of another, and in insisting that you not just do things to serve your city in this case, but in fact, rather than that, we also impose conditions on them in that regard. It's the very argument that we have with the federal government, in which the federal government, we've argued, should not, in flowing funds into Alberta, then impose conditions out of Ottawa on the province. Now, the argument stands up in the next step, that the province should not impose conditions on municipalities. They are elected, they are representatives of their constituents. If they are doing things that are wrong, their constituents will change it.
But surely the public expects conditions of decency attached to the expenditure of public money. Mr. Speaker, back to the Minister of Transportation. In order to get closer to the alleged hourly rates when paid by the loads, truckers are forced to break speed limits and load limits and indeed littering laws. Will the Minister not agree it would be a practical as well as a fair step to enforce fair rate clauses to go along with all government funding?
Mr. Speaker, the ideal situation would be to go to the open tender system where you sharpen your pencil, put your tender in, and if you're the low bidder, you get the job. Some years ago, we placed a set of rates for the Department of Transportation. A number of the municipalities, a number of other groups have used that, truckers included, as the base for what rates should be. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned in my answers last Thursday, Mr. Speaker, there was a request to increase those particular rates, and I said that I was having difficulty in the sense that in today's times that it would be cheaper, quote the word cheaper, if we were to tender those projects, and I was prepared to keep those rates in place at least for another year.
Thank you. Calgary-Buffalo, followed by Edmonton-Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a question to the Premier initially. This provincial government is the most secretive government in North America and refuses to provide to the people of Alberta any information whatsoever with respect to over $2 billion of loans, grants, and guarantees to private business in the last few years. Yet the government refuses to enact freedom of information legislation on the basis that it runs an open government. Will Rogers once said, "Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?" Now, to the Premier, why does this government refuse to release copies of grant, loan, and guarantee agreements where public money is being used so that Albertans can see for themselves the terms upon which this $2 billion is being used? Why are we hiding this information?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member starts off with an allegation in his initial question that obviously is false. He starts off by saying, in North America, this is the most secretive government. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, I don't accept that allegation right off at the beginning. But secondly, the honourable member then makes a case that there is some general sweeping position he'd like to make, that the government should do those things that perhaps would dramatically damage the competitive position of Alberta companies, Alberta businesses, Albertans who are trying to build those businesses in our province, who are trying to compete with people not just in Alberta, but throughout the world. And now he, in some narrow political way, wants to say, we've got to have that, lay it out here in the legislature, and damage the... And that is when the government objects and says, no, we must respect the competitive position of those corporations, those companies, often small businessmen. And we are not going to follow his position, which is to damage them and prevent them from being able to compete.
Well, that's incredible nonsense, Mr. Speaker, because the government purports to give us full details in their press releases. So is the Premier saying that we aren't getting full details in these press releases, and that there is hidden information in these agreements? And if there isn't hidden information, then why can't we have...
Thank you, honourable member. That's now 3 questions.
It's interesting, again, Mr. Speaker, we have an example of the honourable member asking his first question, having the rest written out in advance, and ignoring the answer to his question and going on as though he had got an unsatisfactory answer. I answered... I won't repeat again what I said yesterday, Mr. Speaker, but if they continue to be rude in the legislature and to the people in the balcony by trying to somehow prevent them from hearing what's going on in the legislature, I think we should point it out. Again, Mr. Speaker, in answering my answer to his first question, I pointed out that the government provides all the information we possibly can, and he makes the point himself that in the press release he gets lots of information. He then can put items on the order paper, motion for return, the House deals with it, and if it happens...
Thank you. If there is time, perhaps we could get on to having a supplementary question by the member for Calgary-Buffalo without all the back chat. Thank you.
To the Minister of Energy, in respect of the latest deal, the $191 million of public money being loaned for the Husky upgrader, what more is in the agreement that the Minister hasn't told us about? And if there isn't any more, what's the problem with releasing the documents so we can see for ourselves?
If the honourable member has a desire to get more information, he can put it on the order paper.
Well, that's the usual. Now we have, to the Premier, we have $67 million of government grants and loans to gainers in support of Peter Pocklington, who left creditors holding the bag when his Fidelity Trust went under. Now why can't we see the deal so that Albertans can see whether Mr. Pocklington's personal assets back up the deal this time, or whether we're going to get left holding the bag alone if something happens to gainers?
Again, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member has the opportunity, as every member has, to place requests for information on the order paper. And as I was saying earlier, when...
Thank you, honourable Premier. Honourable Premier. Duly noted. Honourable Premier.
I should only point out, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party representative has asked the question, and then when you're answering the question, they make so much noise, the leader of the Liberal Party makes so much noise they can't hear, and you, sir, must interfere to bring some measure of decorum to the House.
I think with due respect to all members of the House, question period is finished. Chair recognizes on points of order the Minister of the Environment, followed by... Thank you. That's right. As a matter of fact, the chair can. The chair, that's fine. We'll just sit here for a half moment. Now, having made the point, the chair recognizes the Premier to finish a statement before we finish question period, and the Clover Bar has been recognized for supplementary.
I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, the very effective way you made the point I was trying to make. And Mr. Speaker, therefore I conclude by saying that all members of the legislature, and its parliamentary tradition, one that this House certainly respects, is when there is additional information that a member wishes to obtain, either in being a document or even in a written question, as is custom in this legislature, all they have to do is put it on the order paper and the House decides.
Time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions? Opposed? Clover Bar.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the Premier. Has the government given any consideration where public funds have been lent to individuals in the province, that with the individual who's received the loan or grant, if he gives permission, that that information can be made public? Has the government given any thought to allowing that information to be made public?
Mr. Speaker, yes, consideration is always given to that. As a matter of fact, the government will never table an individual's private correspondence without first checking with the person, individual, sometimes I guess it would be a corporation, if they agree that it can be made public. That's a policy of the government. We've always done that. It also is true of the House of Commons. They ask us before they can publish or put out in the House documents from us to them. We respect that with the House of Commons, also with other provincial governments and with individuals. The member's point is well taken.
The Calgary Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, given that the government is so selective in the provision of information, when will it support a Freedom of Information Act?
Mr. Speaker, as I was saying earlier, with the open availability of information, practice in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, we have not felt there was any need for additional legislation. Now, once again, Mr. Speaker, in our parliamentary tradition, there is an opportunity for members to introduce legislation or resolutions leading to legislation. I invite the honourable members that it would be an excellent initiative on their part. It would certainly accomplish a lot more than by leading off with the kind of questions we had in the House today, which weren't in any way productive in the legislature.
Right. Minister of the Environment on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, in fact, in the first question raised in the question period, the Leader of the Opposition made the following statement, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, our friend, the Minister of the Environment, gave a little speech to the Conservatives in Athabasca. In the speech, among other things, I take it, he suggested that residents of the local area could not expect such things as government funding and projects unless they elected a member of the Premier's party. I am told that he's made similar speeches around the province, mainly in opposition ridings. My question to the Premier: has the Premier disciplined the Minister of the Environment and told him very clearly that these types of public statements are sleazy and unacceptable? Mr. Speaker, in rising to this point of order, I would like to cite from Beauchene's Parliamentary Rules and Forms, the 5th edition. I would like to cite, first of all, Section 235, which basically causes any member, and I quote, is entitled even bound, to bring to the Speaker's immediate notice any instance in which he considers a breach of order. And by doing so, Mr. Speaker, I'm rising as a result of Section 235, and I'd like to cite as the basis for the point of order that I'm raising this afternoon from Beauchene, numbers 357A, which basically says a question, oral or written, must not A, be ironical, rhetorical, offensive, or contain epithet, innuendo, satire, or ridicule. I would like to cite as well Section F, which contains an expression of opinion, Section H, which basically says contains inferences, Section I, which says contains imputations, Section Q, Mr. Speaker, which says contain or imply charges of a personal nature. As well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to cite, and I'm citing this on the basis of a bit of unknown here because the Leader of the Opposition...
Forgive me, Honourable Member. The Chair is not prepared to have the member continue. The interruptions continue. It's difficult enough to try to keep up to all the notations that are being cited. Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would as well like to cite from Section 358B, not inquire whether statements made in a newspaper are correct. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to cite also in preparedness for this presentation I'm going to be making in this point of order, sections from Section 359, Item 1, must be a question, not an expression of an opinion, representation, argumentation, nor debate. Section 7, a question must adhere to the proprietors of the House in terms of inferences, imputing motives, or casting aspersions upon persons within the House or out of it. And Section 10, a question not to refer to a statement made outside the House by a minister. Mr. Speaker, it's important that I rise in this point of order because there were only 2 members of this Legislative Assembly who were with me on February 3, 1988, when I apparently made certain statements to some folks in Athabasca. One other member of this Legislative Assembly was there, and that member is present in this House. It is very important, Mr. Speaker, at the outset for me to note that the Leader of the Opposition was not there, and neither was the Leader of the Liberal Party. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think what's really important, because this matter was highlighted...
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Order, please.
Order in press gallery. Mr. Speaker is standing. Thank you.
This might be a very interesting afternoon of me having to be jack-in-the-box. I will continue to stand and interrupt if the noise continues. Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the comments that were made by the Leader of the Opposition today are very serious ones. I repeat, 1 member of this Assembly was present at that meeting dated February 3, 1988. It was held in Boyle, and it was a speech that I gave to the Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche Progressive Conservative Association. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to quote from that speech the exact words that were made that evening. And I think it's kind of important, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the innuendo and the statements made by the Leader of the Opposition, and all people in Alberta.
It's out of order to quote to it. He can't quote a speech outside the House. He's made his points. He can't read a speech back in the House.
The Minister of the Environment may read 1, 2 brief sentences from the speech. There's no prohibition. This is clarification with respect to an allegation that was made by another member towards another member. The Chair will indeed recognize the Leader of the Opposition in due course.
Mr. Speaker, it should be noted that the speech that I gave at Boyle that evening was some 20 minutes to 25 minutes in duration. But I would like to point out just several quotations, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the guidance that you gave. One, to set the theme and the tempo, and I quote, "First of all, what is politics, and why is it so important that all of us become involved with it?" Webster's dictionary defines politics as, quote, "the art or science concerned with guiding or influencing governmental policies or actions," end quote. Mr. Speaker, then what I went on to do in that speech is to point out the effectiveness of 3 former Progressive Conservative MLAs in that particular area, Mr. Frank Appleby, Mr. Norm Wiest, and the late Ron Teslin. And then I went on to cite pages and pages of examples of important projects that were delivered to the people of that particular riding by effective Progressive Conservative MLAs. Then I also, Mr. Speaker, went on to point out that in addition to that, then in essence decisions are made in government by way of a system that we have known as a caucus system, the Legislative Assembly system, and it is a truism that the current member from Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche is not, I repeat, not a member of the government caucus. And I pointed out very well as well, Mr. Speaker, 150 miles of primary highway that previous members have done, and I also pointed out that in the turn...
With due respect, Honourable Minister, it really should be succinctly whether or not you made any comment that was germane to the point as raised today, please.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition is basically saying is that I said that. And he does say, though, I take it, and I don't know what that means, suggested that residents of the local area could not expect such things as government funding. And I've never made that statement, Mr. Speaker. That statement was never made in this speech, and I'd be very, very happy to table the full, complete speech for all members of the Legislative Assembly and forwarded to anyone else. And I've also, and the Leader of the Opposition says, I'm told that he's made similar speeches around the province, mainly in opposition ridings. All of my speeches are available to any citizen in the province of Alberta. In fact, we get quite a few requests for those speeches, Mr. Speaker, and I'd be very pleased to table them.
I understand that the estimates of the Department of Education are perhaps going to be heard this afternoon. Is this perhaps the end of this statement, which is of educational value to all members of the House?
I truly believe it is, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to conclude by saying, by quoting the last several paragraphs, which are perhaps the most important, when I state the Athabasca-Lac-La Biche constituency has a unique and exciting challenge before it. In order to win the seat back, the local constituency must continue to increase its membership and encourage good candidates to run for the nomination. Above all, the constituency association must be unified, and everybody must agree to work as hard as possible for the nominated Conservative candidate. Please do not make the challenge any more difficult than it needs to be. Your constituency has the potential to be involved in our province's exciting future, and the decision is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's one of the most unusual points of order that I've heard. I'm glad I'm able to get the honourable member on television the odd time, you know, and I'm sure we'll all wait with bated breath to read the rest of his speeches, the thoughts of Chairman Kowalski as he goes around the province. Mr. Speaker, on the point of order, and I'm sorry that I offended the Honourable Minister of the Environment, the member from Barhead, was trying to make a point, as you know, under 357(1)(z), you can question government policies and statements made outside the House in terms of written questions. And I was trying to get to a government policy that is a very serious matter. That is what the government involvement is in opposition ridings. And the point that we're trying to make, and doesn't seem to be clear to the honourable member or the honourable members outside, is that government is elected to serve all the people in the province fairly, not just those with government members. And the point why this is germane and certainly important to raise is we have examples of this government going around bringing in backbenchers to go into government members' constituencies and hand out checks. And this is particularly in opposition members' ridings and hand out checks. Now, this to me is an important morality issue for government, and I was trying to raise it in the context of the statements that were being made. Now, if the member says that he's been misquoted and everybody else is wrong, how they perceive that speech, I'll accept the member's words on it. But the point that I want to make is that this is a very important issue. And we're going to have nominated Tory candidates probably going around, not even elected, handing out checks next, Mr. Speaker. That's the point.
The chair then takes it as understanding, having listened to more than one or two or three words, that the minister has said that he has been misquoted. The Leader of the Opposition has taken the word of the Minister of the Environment that he has indeed been misquoted, and it is the understanding of the chair that the Leader of the Opposition then has withdrawn the word sleazy. Thank you.
In point of order, I never did call the minister, my good friend over there, sleazy. I had to say, what I did say, and he quoted, is about statements that were made. It was not, if those statements are made, they were sleazy. I didn't call the minister sleazy.
That's right. Mr. Speaker, it's the very point I made in the question period when I was referring to the honourable member, and that is, it's even worse to try and frame your comments in a way to still impute the word, and yet to try in a tricky way, indirect way, to squirm your way around the rules. I think that isn't probably not only as bad, it's even worse. And for the honourable member now to say, well, I framed my words in such a way that I left the imputation, but I really didn't, and you can't catch me within the rules, I think is shameful. Shameful.
On the point of order, this government is sleazy, but that's not the point. That's not the point. They're doing it. They're doing it whether the Premier likes it or not. That's the reality.
With due respect, honourable members, the matter is even more curiouser and curiouser. It is not terribly helpful to have the last comment, because that then can raise yet another point of order about parliamentary language. And with respect to what the chair was trying to delineate earlier was that in actual fact here, the word sleazy is not really a tremendously popular parliamentary word to be using under any circumstance. The understanding of the chair still is that the Minister of the Environment claims that he did not do what had been purported to have been done, and that hopefully the Leader of the Opposition would withdraw the word sleazy in that context, and that together in the House we would try to be a bit more appropriate about the words. Well, all right, then the... Please, honourable member. Thank you. All right, the chair has been wrong in its interpretation. The minister has said one thing. The Leader of the Opposition does not intend to withdraw the word sleazy in the context. The chair has examined the list of words that are parliamentary and unparliamentary, and indeed the word sleazy does not seem to be there as a prohibition nor as one that is acceptable. So it's one that has been used today, and it's been not terribly positive in terms of what the parliamentary process and deportment of the House is in this chamber. I assume then that we have reached what is a stalemate with regard to a complaint between two members. There is yet another point of order as raised by Westlock Sturgeon.
Speaker, it's a point of order I raised of the Premier answering on the questions from the honourable member for Calgary Buffalo. He has used a practice with many members on the opposite side, saying that no, he's not keeping anything secret. Some question. If you want the answer to the question, all you have to do is put it on the order paper, Mr. Speaker. Well, I feel, according to Beauchesne in either 322 or also in 357, that questions, they get information that the Premier is coming very close to misleading the House in giving the impression that if he put the question on the order paper, we get answered. And for example, Mr. Speaker, the very question that the honourable member for Calgary Buffalo asked today about the loan guarantee of $55 million made on March the 3rd between the government and gainers, it's been on the order paper for some time by the honourable by the member from Westlock Sturgeon, Mr. Speaker. And this is only one example, but I can cite most of these motions which are gone over time and again by the House Leader. And so I believe that if there is possible for the Premier to mislead the House, he is doing so when he says, put it on the order paper and it'll be answered. Putting it on the order paper in this House has been tantamount to just forgetting it forever. So I believe that, Mr. Speaker, that you should call the Premier or any minister to task that says put it on the order paper if it has already been on the order paper for a week. Surely that it becomes quite clear then that whoever's answering on the front bench with that type of answer is doing nothing but try to get out an answer, which is honest enough. But be honest about it. Say, I refuse to give an answer, and sit down. Not say put it on the order paper when it's been there for over a week already.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party seems to not be anticipating with much enjoyment the estimates of the Minister of Education, because he certainly seems to be filling the House's time with matters that are relatively frivolous compared to the items that she will want to discuss on the education of our children. But, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party unfortunately missed one very important...
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Again, we'd like to have a little less noise so we could hear what's happening here. Premier, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for continuing to make the point I've been making about the opposition's making so much noise in the House that people in the gallery or ourselves can't hear. But in any event, the point of my reply to him was, put it on the order paper, and the House deals with it. And he keeps forgetting that point. It's the legislature that deals with motions for return. It's not somebody refusing to do something. The House deals with it. And again, I encourage the honourable member to put resolutions on, move bills, move motions for return, written questions, and the House decides. No individual member decides, the House decides.
On this particular point of order. All right. With due respect to this particular point of order as being raised by the member for Westlock Sturgeon, it is indeed within the tradition of this House as well as House of Commons in Ottawa that various items may be directed to be placed on the order paper, whether as written questions or as motions for return. It is also noted that that can be done voluntarily by a member, with the usual matter of the wording being, the appropriate wording being vetted by the table officers and the chair before it appears in the order paper. Or it may also be directed by the Speaker to occur because of the question being requesting information that is far too detailed and using up the time of question period. For the honourable member for Westlock Sturgeon to raise a complaint about the fact that something may have been on the order paper either as motion for return or a written question and it's been on there for a week or two, that again is a complaint which is not really well founded, because the tradition of this legislature as well as the House of Commons and other legislatures is that written questions and motions for return do indeed stand on the order paper for some considerable length of time. It's very rare that they are dealt with in the space of time of 1 or 2 weeks. To complicate the issue further, the House has been in somewhat of hiatus on this matter of dealing with motions for return and written questions. And as yesterday, the chair requested the House leaders for the various political parties to meet together to come to some resolution to the matter of Understanding Order 34 to deal with these issues. And it is the understanding of the chair that a meeting did indeed transpire either late yesterday afternoon or earlier today. The chair has been in receipt of a note from the government House leader, which the chair hasn't had time to read in the flurry of activity this afternoon, but it does look like there is some resolution to the matter, so that perhaps as early as tomorrow that various items may be dealt with in regard to written questions and motions for return. But again, the House was held up until such time as the House leaders for the various parties could come to consensus on the issue. The other thing that should be borne in mind, honourable member for Westlock Sturgeon, is that indeed when motions for return do come for discussion in the House, that there is indeed the opportunity, the forum for discussion, which usually takes place on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the normal course of events. And therefore, the chair really doesn't regard this as being a point of order, but again, a matter of complaint, but perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about the process, and hopefully the comments will help to bridge over to what the new procedure will be, if not for tomorrow, but certainly by next Tuesday. Are there any additional points of order that we might deal with this afternoon? Orders of the day, might we revert briefly to the introduction of guests?